Thank you for this opportunity to join you all this morning. For you, as as was mentioned by Susanna, it is now 9 in the evening, and actually we are beginning a typhoon. So will be nice for not having to go to school in the morning. Um, Let me begin today. I'd like to talk about the experience of poverty, as was mentioned. Artificial intelligence, we are told, is an important technology for our future. China, where I currently live in South Korea, set up huge research funds for developing AI starting in 2017 after AlphaGo beat world Go champion Seto Lee. Even more money was earmarked by various governments following the release of ChatGPT in 2022. And Elon Musk captured the title World's Richest after his stocks skyrocketed following his 2021 AI Day. As a university professor, I have encountered no shortage of proclamations about the inevitable AI future. Our research officers pronounce AI to be the future we need to prepare for. Hundreds of thousands or even millions of Hong Kong dollars developed are tied to AI research projects. We've developed an AI roadmap for our teachers and students, which focuses on equipping our students to use AI in their future work. And students themselves have bought into this wholeheartedly. I have probably read over a dozen papers in the last 2 years that begin with some variation of my opening line without the qualification. Artificial intelligence is important for our future. STS scholar Lee Vinsel defines this attention to as critahype. The attention that has been given to AI in the last few years hypes up the technology as the ultimate technology. Luciano Floridi and others have recently produced a study that shows how the concept of AI ethics has become an incredibly popular field, with literally thousands of new jobs opening in Europe in the past 2 years. Why so many so called ethicists? Because, as Vinsel notes, AI is billed simultaneously as the most important technology for our future and as a potentially cataclysmic technology. A more sober analysis, Vinsel contends, would note that AI's disruption will have to be drawn out disruption to be truly impactful. Although automobiles were certainly the source of much social concern in their early years, they did not transform cities into dystopian concrete jungles for a few decades. So rather than a grandiose prediction about how AI will change every single aspect of our lives, of a very feature of human existence, from our most tedious labor to our relationships to our entertainment to even our religious beliefs, we ought to look at the ways AI is actually changing things. Real AI ethicists, and not merely legal and public opinion officers or science fiction fans trying their hand at philosophy, have noted that actual problems of AI today include bias, uncritical trust, privacy and transparency, and environmental impacts. AIs are not objective analytic engines revealing truth to those who ask. They are models off of the assumptions of their programmers, assumptions which have their own limitations and biases. And because of these biases, we should not uncritically trust what comes out of the AI. It's also important to ask how the machine is working, how it gets the answers it gets, and what happens to people's data that goes into the machine. And all of this, we should remember, is done by energy costly machines, which contribute to the worsening effects of climate change. These worries may not be as dramatic as Nick Bostrom's fear that a paperclip producing machine could destroy the planet, but they are real world concerns which affect real people and our real experience in the world. I find it surprising that in the midst of these conversations, very few people have asked the question about what happens to the poor. If this question arises, it is often framed only in terms of labor, that is, whose jobs will be displaced by AI. Other facets of poverty, such as illness, housing, security, and food, are ignored. They don't seem relevant. And why would they be relevant? The reality is that the inclusion of the poor in the discussion of AI is deeply revealing about what is most troubling about the technology. Real human concerns, as I suggest, are often brought up only by sober minded thinkers, not prophets of either doom or prosperity. AI is not a technology which fits into our real human lives. It is a technology of fantasy and always has been. Since the 1950s, when people like Alan Turing, John McCarthy, and Marvin Minsky were creating the field and trying to divine just how to make a pile of vacuum tubes think like a human being, AI researchers and any who listen to them have been convinced that we have the power to create our own Frankenstein's monsters, albeit in a calculating machine rather than stitched together organic tissue. But since the 1960s, critics like Hubert Dreyfus have noted that the human mind is far more than a simple calculating machine. To be in a world is to have been raised in a world, to grow up with a certain understanding of how things work, and framed by language, culture, religion, and communities. The creation story of Adam, taken from the soil of the earth, is a fitting model for humans. We rise from the dust, not descend from the heavens already complete. In the next half hour, I want to outline why I think much of the interest in AI right now is dangerous to the poor. I do not mean that AI itself is a dangerous technology to the poor, but the interests at stake in developing and using it in nearly every setting are designed to benefit the rich and powerful, with the effect of further disenfranchising the poor. My comments shall focus on a few specific concerns: the problems of resources and wealth, the values inbuilt to AI, and in my view, the most concerning, the anthropomorphizing of AI. First critique of AI written by a philosopher was Hubert Dreyfus's paper Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence, published in 1965. The point Dreyfus made then, which he reiterated in his book What Computers Can't Do, is that some forms of thinking are not programmable, and so assuming that a machine can think like a human is similar to the fantasies of the alchemists. I like his turn of phrase, but like to consider AI as a sort of philosopher's stone. The language that has been used to market AI has certainly not shied from promising it will be a miraculous technology, improving every aspect of human life. People almost also promise unlimited economic growth through it. Truly, if AI is capable of fulfilling all our economic wishes, it is the promise of transmutation that alchemists long hoped for. The problem, of course, is that there's no such thing as an unlimited economic growth. We live in a finite universe on a planet with only so many resources. What's worse, thanks to what we know about the expansion of the universe and the laws of entropy, every exchange involves a loss. In the food chain, fewer animals live at the top because predation cannot fully capture the calories grazers consume. Pendulums wind down. The idea of perpetual motion machine is pure fantasy. AI cannot create ex nihilo, and the cost of generating and creating and running AI, as noted by increasingly more scholars, is extremely high compared to other technologies. E.F. Schumacher noted in 1966 that the capitalist desire for continual growth cannot be sustained, and that we should adopt what he called a Buddhist economic system of balance and harmony. In the 1970s, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis argued that our planet functions like an organism with multiple spheres: biosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, working like organ systems. In 1968, Buckminster Fuller wrote Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, emphasizing the limited resources our planet has as it travels through space. In short, for over 50 years, the problem of uncritical consumption of resources has been clearly defined. Those who believe AI will solve all problems, including climate change, haven't bothered to do their own homework on the subject. What this means then is that when we spend money and use resources for the development and deployment of AI, we use resources that could be otherwise given to the poor. Of course, the same argument can be made for any variety of our economic activities, such as the entertainment industry, fashion industry, and such a point was made prophetically by the US bishops against the weapons industry in 1983. However, nobody has claimed that we need to heavily invest in Disney parks or Gucci to save ourselves and our planet. Effective altruists, however, make just this argument when they funnel their charity donations back into the same tech companies they own. The unsubstantiated claim that AI may help us address certain problems related to the environmental crises or economic inequality becomes justification for further investing in AI. As critics like Emil Torres and Timnit Gebru have noted, there is a sort of colonial mentality when rich white Westerners decide that AI research is more important for our future than mosquito nets. This is terribly ironic. The effective altruism movement was started based on Peter Singer's argument that the wealthy have a duty to give all of their excess wealth to those in need because it will produce much more good that way. If the argument for effective altruism is that it can help more people than capitalism alone, then the money given should be given to those in need. The point, of course, isn't that we are donating money in the wrong direction. The point, as I will explain soon, is that investing in AI is investing in technology which does not actually help the poor. So when Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, claims that AI is the only solution to climate change, we must loudly protest. AI is a deeply energy wasteful and resource intensive technology, currently actively worsening climate change. And beyond the specific misallocation of resources that could go to the poor, the environmental effects of climate change disproportionately affect the poor. AI does at present have the benefit of providing work for the poor, albeit in an exploitative way. Freelance Hong Kong journalist Karen Howe has reported on ghost work done in countries like Venezuela and Kenya to train AIs. The ghost workers often have to compete with each other for contracts since work is not guaranteed or stable. In the case of Kenyan workers training GPT, repeatedly reviewing obscene generated text to make the program safer led workers to have psychological problems. The training work is not meant to be permanent either. It is meant to be a stopgap solution until the AI can function without human assistance. Let us also note that many economic forecasters have predicted that AI will disrupt industries and lead to job loss, or as they say, reskilling. Often these conversations focus on situations in wealthy countries. But what happens when chatbots become sophisticated enough that call centers in India and the Philippines are no longer needed? What happens when robotics and machine vision make manufacturing jobs in Vietnam and Bangladesh obsolete? While the gray market is prevalent for most of the economic activity in poorer countries, generation of wealth in a globalized world entails chains of production, many of which stand to be disrupted when automated machines become cheaper than human labor. And in the end, Silicon Valley's largesse stands as a stark reminder of the Matthew effect. The rich get richer while the poor get poorer. Of the top 10 companies by market cap, eight are involved in AI in various ways, including Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation and NVIDIA, companies that only recently broke into the top 10 because of the hardware needs of AI. Many people believe that technologies are inherently value neutral. Theologian Mark Graham argued 12 years ago that Catholic theological ethics of technology was so underdeveloped because of the priority of the ethics of use. In his view, technologies are seen as mere extensions of our own intentions and not themselves morally significant, or at least in the views of the ethics of use. Sorry. The problem with this idea is that it simply isn't true. Technologies are built with an intention in mind. It is true that a hammer can be used to murder someone, just as it can be used to build a house. But the intention of the hammer maker is to empower carpenters to build, not to empower murderers. And what is more important, the technology itself conveys these inbuilt values to us. Following the post phenomenological model pioneered by Don Idy, we can say that technologies mediate the world to us. This mediation includes certain values. Architecture is an obvious example of this. Langdon Winter contended that Robert Moses built a bridge to Long Island that was too short to allow buses full of poor people of color from the city to come to the beach. Robert Rosenberger has illustrated many cases of hostile architecture designed to keep homeless people from being in public view. With this in mind, some scholars suggest value sensitive design as an approach to technology ethics. In this approach, we start developing technologies not from economic impetus or just for the sake of innovation, but with specific ethical values in mind. We can see echoes of this concern in discussions of AI ethics as people discuss making AI more democratic or transparent. We want to build in values to AI that are not currently present in its operation. We can also see that some government funded projects, such as EU's Horizons programs, are intended to achieve specific outcomes from developing AIs, such as increasing crop yields, lessening work injuries, or providing better assistance to the disabled. On this front, AI can be developed in ways that help the poor, but it isn't clear that this will be done. For example, Virginia Eubanks notes that how the US state of Indiana developed an automated system to handle their welfare program back in 2008. The aim was to cut out corruption and waste, but the effect was that many deserving poor were cut off from their needed benefits due to loss of paperwork, computer glitches, and untrained support staff. Many scholars have pointed out how the COMPASS algorithm, designed to predict recidivism rates, reproduced biases inbuilt in the judicial system, and so gave harsher punishments to people of color. Kathy O'Neill has highlighted how automated loan processing is more likely to deny loans to the poor as well. Cases like this she calls weapons of math destruction, tools which rely on mathematics and which can cause large scale devastation if they are overly trusted. I'm also skeptical that AI can be of much use to the poor because it is built off of premises of mathematical efficiency. The logic of mathematical efficiency is not a humane logic. There's a reason we contrast the cold and robotic with the warm and human. Despite the rhetoric of economists who think we are all rational, self-interested actors, we often do things for others independent of our benefits, out of pure altruism. Part of being human generally includes relationships, rituals, customs, aesthetics, and story, not necessary flourishes, but as essential as water and air. When AlphaGo beat Sado Lee, Korean media noted that the machine violated Go protocol by moving while Lee was out of the room, a faux pas for any experienced Go player, but one that is purely customary and not inherent to the game itself. Within the logic of mathematical efficiency, whatever is extraneous to our goal is considered a burden. Nobel winning economist Milton Friedman said that the business leaders had only one obligation to maximize profits within the confines of law. But since maximizing profits is the standards, many companies feel no qualms about flaunting the law, especially if the consequence doesn't affect their profitability. What's more, this entails all sorts of abuses to laborers who are typically considered necessary expenditures for the company and not part of who gets to share the profit. In the US, the most common and most costly form of theft by a huge margin is wage theft. But most global companies prefer to outsource their labor anyway to areas where wages are even lower and safety and environmental standards are lower. And though the wise critic may note that ultimately it is not efficient to wantonly use all of our natural resources, the focus on immediate profit does not attend to long term problems. Every AI created by a for profit tech company will be created especially to make money and lower costs. The way the machine does this may differ, but ultimately the goal is the essential goal of all actors in a capitalist system. Already the problem is clear. If Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, and other companies deploy AI, it will be either to generate value or lower costs. Sabina Pfeiffer argues that the digital technologies increase profits usually by lowering costs, though she suggests AI may actually be able to generate value. How would an expensive technology like AI lower costs? By lowering the human cost, that is, by reducing labor. In short, by cutting wages, either in pure numbers or in relation to GDP. This, I think, is the basic form of the problem. The notion of mathematical efficiency, typical of late capitalist society, is one that externalizes whatever cost it can and prioritizes only immediate benefit. A company whose workers rely on governmental aid can still be considered successful because they have successfully outsourced their costs. It is not efficient on a pure scale, but it is efficient in the eyes of the company, which offloads its costs onto broader society. And this sort of mindset is present in the eyes of AI programmers, whose task is likewise to use a broken model of the world, apply mathematics to it, and take it as a predictor of reality. Put in concrete terms, it works like this. The model that any AI programmer builds is based off of his own perceptions of the world, perceptions which include blind spots and ignorance. So, facial recognition programmers in Silicon Valley did not realize their datasets did not include enough faces of women or ethnic minorities, for example. If the model is deployed, it may carry out significant devastation before being corrected or noticed, such as police relying on these facial recognition programs more than their own eyes. Ultimately, however, if the program is considered successful according to specific mathematically definable criteria set by the creator, then any other negative cost will be considered acceptable. This has the effect that even the most nobly intended iterations of AI will expect specific benchmarks and tangible results, quantitative proof of the goodness that they have done. If the AI does not yield the specific aims the government seeks, it may be shut down. The specific aims the program meets must also be expressed in purely mathematical forms, such which lends itself easily to the specifically capitalistic goal of evaluating things merely in terms of profit and loss. While this can be designed to yield concrete benefits for a specified population, it does so assuming quantitative outputs are what ultimately matters. The poor who may be served are necessarily reduced to numbers. Not every problem facing the poor can be solved with quantitative analysis. Thus, I highlight the insight of Father John Sobrino, echoing his mentor Ignacio Ellacuría. As the Catholic Church has done since the 1960s, Sobrino critiques the idea that global poverty is just a question of what first world countries define as development. Development means parroting the style of the rich and industrialized, and is, as we know from the environmental crisis, unsustainable. Sobrino calls this model the civilization of wealth, in contrast to the civilization of poverty, one which prioritizes human rights and community. While it is clear, as some human rights scholars like Jack Donnelly note, that full support of human rights may require a certain level of development, there is a fundamentally different orientation in developing for the purpose of fulfilling human rights rather than for the purpose of development itself. AI as a tool of development can only measure human rights in an approximate way and is subject to shortcomings if the modelers do not fully recognize the situation on the ground. This is likely as long as, once again channeling liberation theology's prophetic witness, the poor are left nameless and voiceless. If the poor are not given the chance to advocate for themselves to human others, those who can respond to the demand placed upon them by virtue of their dignity inherent in the poor, then they will be relegated to statistics. To bring it full circle, a final issue is AI is built in societies which inherently disvalue the poor. In the US, for example, the leading country in AI development, moral approval is nearly synonymous with material wealth. A rich man is a good man, and the poor and homeless are considered to be poor in character as well. Max Weber's Protestant ethic is most indicated in this landscape. The poor are considered to have deserved their fate in the US, where Silicon Valley tech pros complain about the existence of homeless persons who have been displaced by higher costs of living. As such, it is doubtful that countries like the US will be interested in developing AI with the specific goal of helping the poor at all. Finally, though I think this is already suggested by what I have said already, the most pernicious danger of AI is the way we tend to anthropomorphize it. Even the term intelligence, entailed in its designation, is meant to suggest that AI is something like us, as we describe things we identify with as intelligent. The philosopher David Kunkel makes this explicit. The discussions of AI rights is couched within the assumption that intelligence corresponds to moral agency and patiency, as demonstrated, for example, in the animal rights movement following Peter Singer. He once again appears today. In this view, if AI demonstrates sufficient human capacities, particularly whatever we define as intelligent, then it should be awarded moral status. This tendency is well documented through our moral traditions. A snapshot of moral theories is illustrative. Kant thinks that rational beings alone must be treated as ends in themselves. Mill thinks the capacity for pleasure with varying degrees according to one's intellectual growth is a standard for moral patiency. Thomas Aquinas notes that human dignity is due to our being rational, like God. Aristotle believes that the highest form of living is contemplating pure wisdom. Ordinarily, in environmental ethics, for example, we would discuss all of these as indicative of anthropocentrism, but even non strictly anthropocentric models tend to repeat this, as indicated by much of the animal rights movement, which values animals mostly insofar as they share certain capacities with us. A number of critical theories have pointed out that this sort of logic has always had a hierarchical order to it. Feminists, for example, point out that in many typical expressions, Rationality is associated with being male, while animalism is associated with being female, leading to a de facto higher value to men than to women. The eugenics movement also claimed that different races were results of better and worse breeding. So, this preference for rational humans always has the effect of creating an uneven order and favoring some over others. Not even 50 years ago, countries like the US still had laws that allowed for forced sterilization of people with mental illness, mental disability, or other unfavorable traits. Iceland has nearly eliminated all cases of Down syndrome today through selective abortion. And as the US prepares for another Donald Trump presidency, critiques of him conflate his moral failings with his mental failings. We are not so removed from what we consider barbarism. Our favoring of a certain image of the rational mind becomes a synonym for us of what is good and beautiful. And most of us uncritically accept this. Even I, aware of this problem, often catch myself using terms like dumb and stupid, crazy and sane, or idiotic when I mean that something is unjust, harmful, or simply wrong. This is a problem because the machines we are discussing are meant to be intelligent, and this characteristic of the machines is meant to suggest that they are somehow better. And then, when discussions of robot rights arise, we see that goodness, intelligence, and rights are wrapped inextricably into a single thread. We do not ask whether a washing machine or an industrial welder should be given human rights. We assume that an AI could be given rights because it resembles human beings in the way that we consider relevant for being granted rights, that is, as intelligent agents. But what is the model of intelligence that AI models? As I've noted already, AI is essentially complex algorithms, which are themselves complex mathematical equations. In other words, intelligence as modeled by AI is strictly speaking mathematical intelligence. This reflects a trend Western cultures have taken since the scientific revolution, and one with ties in the past century, unsurprisingly, to eugenics. The intelligence quotient, or IQ, comes from the eugenics movement, is a numerical figure assigned to people based on their ability to complete a standardized test within a certain time limit. Many of the questions involve mathematical and quantitative reasoning. Literature and language questions also appear on the test, but these are to be framed with the specific correct solution as well. So the problem appears mathematical in form. Placing this as the definitive standard of intelligence is obviously troublesome. Not only are creative thinking or alternative solutions considered unintelligent by this measure, but worse is that it requires a certain standardized model of education. Thus, AI's model of intelligence, which is its qualification for rights, is a model built off of bourgeois educational systems. Saying that language should have one specific form, for example, assumes that language spoken by common people, which often is classified with derogatory terms to indicate its lowbrow status, is considered a sign of unintelligence. So, to add another ingredient to the formula, intelligence, consciousness, and rights are also tied into education models. The or under educated are seen by the schooled elite as children who need paternalistic care. Here I find myself skeptical of the liberation theology movement. As good as the intention was of the late Gutierrez to talk about the voicelessness of the poor, the position which he and other European educated priests assumed was often paternalistic. Indeed, the process of conscientization, which Gutierrez emphasizes, a model that he took from Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, assumes the well intended educated professional is in the right position to inform the poor of why their plight is so bad. As Gayatri Spivak provocatively noted, the ventriloquism of the subaltern is a left intellectual's stock in trade. Those who wish to help the poor typically assume they know better how to do this than the poor themselves, and they assume that the poor must be given the proper education to mirror what the well intended elites see of themselves. The AI engineers and designers create a program which is a mirror image of how they see themselves. The standard for its success as an intelligent engine is determined by the programmers based on their own view, their own understanding of intelligence. It is their narcissistic self image built into silicon. While no AI has yet achieved this standard, AI engineers remain optimistic that they have the right view. They just need to make the right breakthrough. Dreyfus critiqued this in his What Computers Can't Do, to the ire of AI pioneers when the problems they faced turned out to be more difficult than they first thought. But in recent years, machine learning has led to much more sophisticated programs, and proof of concept demonstrations like AlphaGo or real world applications like recently Nobel Prize winning AlphaFold give these android dreams some weight. While some AI researchers remain grounded about the limitations of current machine learning, many of the loudest voices, including Elon Musk and Sam Altman, envision that they will soon achieve artificial general intelligence, the current moniker to replace the older, good old fashioned AI, or the now too diverse AI. And following the prophecies of Nick Bostrom, they worry and hope that AGI will quickly become super AGI, an AI far more intelligent than we are. The language they use to imply what this means, such as a human to an ant, reinforces the deeply problematic view of intelligence that underwrites all AI research. The moral worries they have, the threat of existential crisis, or the promise of utopian governance, are ways of suggesting a super AGI will be morally superior to us in just the same ways that we are morally superior, or fancy ourselves to be, to insects, and it reveals their own ethical shortcomings. This sets up a spectrum of moral value, where the more intelligent a being is, based off of a quantitatively defined measure, the more good and dignified it is, while the less intelligent it is, the less so. If the poor lack educational resources, or if the conditions of hunger and precariousness lead to suboptimal neural functioning, or if genetic or epigenetic factors limit the capacity for learning, or if their language usage is considered uncouth, or if the need to survive drives them to prioritize short term gain over long term payoff, or if the experience of capitalist culture leads them to be wary of risking what little they have, they are likely to fall lower on the scale than our machines will. If the implication is not clear, the US saw overturned for interracial marriage bans years before they did for forced sterilization of the mentally ill. A friend of mine put this problem in simple terms. It is troubling to discuss giving rights to machines that lack any sort of self awareness when there are many categories of humans who do not yet enjoy these rights. A version of this frustration was expressed 7 years ago when the Saudi government granted citizenship to Sophia, a gynoid developed here in Hong Kong, while the women of that country still lacked basic rights. We live in a world where the poor and otherwise marginalized often face the following: starvation, malnutrition, human trafficking, exposure to harmful chemicals, lack of sanitation, lack of clean water, violence, substance abuse, specific forms of disease, including tuberculosis, malaria, AIDS, schistosomiasis, heart disease, pneumoconiosis, and obesity. Discussing giving a computer program, the same rights as a bourgeois EU citizen is absolutely ludicrous with this reality still going on. Quote Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount: first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your other brother's eye. In other words, let us grant human rights to all humans first before extending them to non humans. If the problem were so simple, this would not be this would be the end. But what is left unaddressed is the nagging question of why anyone would consider granting AI rights to be more pressing than fixing human problems around us. Theologian Philip Hefner articulated the idea most clearly that AI is a techno mirror in which we see ourselves. I've suggested as much so far, but please note, in the Christian worldview, what makes human beings dignified is our status as imago Dei, being the image of God. Our image then takes a similarly dignified role, but the illusion we should recall in Hefner's metaphor is the myth of Narcissus, whose obsession with his own reflection was to his own detriment. AI, as technomirror, has the function of reflecting our own gaze back to us, a process which Catholic philosopher Jean-Luc Marion refers to as idolatry. Iconography, on the other hand, occurs when an image points beyond itself to something ineffable. In writing about the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida notes that when we speak of the other, the one we refer to is not an alter ego, that is, an other like me. Rather, the other is totally other than me. And so, in their absolute alterity, I must recognize the moral responsibility I bear to one who cannot be reduced to my self image. And here lies the absolute difference between a moral order that considers AI as moral patient and a moral order that recognizes our failures to the poor. AI as moral patient is a variation of the Frankenstein or Pinocchio fantasies. We acknowledge a being not quite human who gains the respect of human beings because we created it and teach it to be like us. And in so doing, it wins our own moral approval. On the other hand, is the more troubling genre of doppelganger fiction, like Edgar Allan Poe's William Wilson or Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Double. In such stories, we have to grapple with an other who may appear to be like me, but is not the same as I am, and whose existence causes me to feel uneasy. We fight it because we cannot bear to live in a world where it exists alongside us and threatens our self image, which we hold so dear. AI is portrayed as a clean, efficient reflection of what we imagine ourselves to be. The poor appear to us as dirty, diseased, craven versions of what we really are. An AI doesn't suffer from schizophrenia or drug withdrawals. It does not carry out petty crimes or public gaffes. It does not demand government aid or charitable assistance. It does not spurn your half hearted, self important charity. It does not sleep on your park benches, beat its children, or stumble drunkenly down the street. It has no fleas or lice. It does not die from infection, overdose, or worksite accident. It doesn't smell or create a nuisance with its public presence. And for all these reasons, AI is a much more comfortable as an other, that is, an alter ego, for the educated elites to respond to than the poor. Being poor, with all its attendant miseries, is the greatest disvalue of the capitalist system. The upper classes relate to the poor only as those who must be avoided, lest contamination set in. The poor may be wretched, but in this view they deserve their fate. To think otherwise may lead one to question why they deserve to live a better life at all. All of this, AI is the pinnacle in the end of capitalist fantasy. It is the expectation of growing wealth ad nauseum and a labor class absent the wages of labor. It is, of course, fantasy, as over 200 years of capitalism and scientific advancement have made it clear that infinite growth is impossible, that the poor generate the actual wealth, and that the cost of AI is generally not worth it. From a moral standpoint, we are more alarmed as AI fantasies tend to harm the poor by disenfranchising them, devaluing them, and dehumanizing them, while reassigning concordant benefits to non conscious machines. This understanding requires us to take a deeper look at poverty than most are comfortable with. We must consider it not only as a condition of being out of cash, but as a socially contextualized position, which includes modes of socialization, processes of legitimizing or delegitimizing one's code of behavior, ethical standards, psychological impacts, and so forth, all of which are deeply despised by dominant culture and which despised features are conspicuously absent from AI programming. But this is not to say AI is a totally useless technology. Karl Marx himself believed the technologies of the bourgeoisie would usher in the classless revolution. AI does quantitative tasks very well and has shown itself to be of tremendous value to scientists, doctors, demographers, and others. So let me end with an optimistic thought. If we can move our thinking so that AI is not correlated with questions of rights, We can find ways to apply AI as as a tool to specific moral problems we need insight for. This must be always done with full awareness of the benefits and failures of AI to avoid the temptation toward uncritical acceptance and unwarranted trust. We may also prefer to change the terminology as intelligence implies a certain metaphysical and metaethical grounding and its associations. Finally, we must reassess our own standards of moral patiency and allow all humans to be given dignity regardless of how well they model the traits of AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Levi Checketts, for your contributions. We already have many questions that may be accessed via chat. And the first question is from Tiradentes, who says, the participation of Elon Musk in the American government may be a potential on the increase of inequality thanks to AI, or the opposite?
Yeah. So, I mean, this to me is very, very troubling because Elon Musk himself has a very he has a track record with AI that I can only see as being in bad faith. Depending on which year and what month of the year one looks at, he either says AI is a great threat or it's the promise that we need. He's variously warned against the dangers of AI and then invested heavily in AI. It's clear for him that the question really amounts to what will make the most money for him. And so having him as an advisor to Trump is deeply worrying because there doesn't seem to be, for Musk's intentions, any real focus on doing moral good. The only focus seems to be increasing his stock value and making sure that he remains in the top place as richest person in the world. So I hope that answers your question. This is my sense, based on everything I've seen him say, based on the way he's invested. He was, you may or may not know, he was one of the initial co-founders of OpenAI, and then he left the position and gave it to Sam Altman. Then he began his own AI company in Tesla, and so he's mostly been interested in it for profit's sake.
Obrigada, professor. A pergunta do Guilherme, a primeira é: percebo que o senhor dá bastante ênfase ao mercado de trabalho na relação entre IA e pobreza. Como a renda básica universal se insere no contexto do trabalho tecnológico precarizado?
Yeah, so this is with labor, there's always a sort of problem that many capitalists don't fully understand where the money comes from. Um, there is this sense the problem of capitalism as a general system is that it functions according to Adam Smith and according to most economists, classical economists, by people acting for self-interested reasons. And when they do so, their self-interests will compete against each other and benefit everybody. Well, the problem is eventually those self-interests overshadow each other. Another problem is that this idea of profit, the profit that is generated, is profit that comes from the value generated by the laborers minus what is paid them. So if if the laborers contribute, say, $5 to something and the product is sold for $10, or sorry, if the product is sold for $5 because the laborers contribute $5 and the laborers are paid $3, the laborers then have $3 which they return to the economy, but you can see there's a loss. The $5 goes to $3, $2 go to the capitalist as his profit, and the $3 go to contributing more to the production of other goods within the economy. This works only as long as you have more and more people somewhere down the line who can buy into things. And so late in the 20th century, production moved from rich countries like the United States into poor countries. A very interesting, a very interesting like history comes from, for example, the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was a steel leader of the world for decades. And then Korea became the steel leader with Pohang Steel Company, POSCO. They were producing high quality steel for cheaper. And so the steel industry in Pittsburgh dried up because now you've got cheaper products. Now POSCO is losing to steel companies in China. So we're always driving costs down for labor. But this only can go so far because eventually, when you've been paying your laborers enough, they get to a point where they make too much money for the to adequately offset the cost of labor. And so you always have to chase cheaper and cheaper labor in order to sustain things. Eventually, this dries up. This is the catastrophe that is waiting to happen. And this is why you see labor markets always moving to cheaper and cheaper places. So we don't know, it's hard to say when this will happen. But what this means then in terms of AI is that if you get rid of labor altogether, you get rid of people who will contribute back into the economy. Because if you're not paying people to do your work, you're not paying people who can buy your product. And so this is one of the most short-sighted ideas that a lot of capitalists have because they're focusing on their own short-term profit. And so they're not concerned about this large-scale system in which the laborers will not have the means to buy the goods that are necessary to keep profits coming in. So this is ultimately right when AI is used to generate higher profits, it comes at the cost of human labor, and perhaps that starts with third world poor countries, labor being done here. For example, a few miles north of me is the city of Shenzhen in China, which is famous for producing a lot of high-end electronics. It's famous for assembling Apple products, for example. And the company that makes those, assembles them, Foxconn, has tried to automate a lot of its labor. So you can do that, but then you will start losing people who can buy your products. And that's one problem that people will face. But that has the bigger problem that in these poor countries, such as Vietnam and Bangladesh, where manufacturing has come in, you're removing a major source of income. This is a wicked problem. I'm not trying to say by any means that exploited labor in these countries is good at all, but I am saying that in a globalized economy, that trying to save costs by cutting off one source of labor is essentially cutting those people off. We saw, sorry, I'm going on a long tangent here, but we saw during the pandemic how this actually really affected a lot of countries as manufacturing in some places dried up and people became poor, as tourism in Southeast Asia was stopped because of travel being stopped, and people began resorting to serious crime, human trafficking, and so forth. Here in Hong Kong, because manufacturing and other work was drying up, people were looking for labor abroad, and the Hong Kong immigration website had warnings encouraging people to be careful of labor scams because Hong Kongers were being trafficked to places like Cambodia and Thailand by gangsters who were thriving because the police were supporting them because tourism had dried up, so there was no money coming in. So one of the problems that a lot of people who are thinking about getting rich from these technologies are unaware of is how much of the global economy is connected to all sorts of uh, chains that cutting one off means depriving an entire population of a lot of the resources they need to survive.
Thank you. Next question. How can we approach public policies for technological inequality? Could you share a little bit more on your experience from Hong Kong and the Asian reality at large?
Yeah. So I think unfortunately the Asian context is not a great indicator. A big part of this is because Asia, because we are currently trying to catch up to the Western world in terms of development and GDP. And I say this despite the fact that I would confidently say that cities like Seoul and Hong Kong and Beijing and Tokyo are much more advanced in terms of infrastructure and technological development than many Western countries, but the economy is not as developed. Um, and so these countries are trying to catch up and overpass. So because of this, we're basically modeling what other countries do. And this means that on one hand, we chase whatever trends we think other countries are chasing. On the other hand, this also means we're more likely to take risks which other countries, Western countries, are not as interested in taking. And this is, of course, quite quite unfortunate. So I mentioned before AI ghost work that for Western AI companies is often outsourced to poorer regions such as Venezuela, Colombia, for some work, more recently with language processing to countries that have high English proficiency with low labor costs, such as Kenya or Philippines. But China also is developing a lot of AI. So there's a huge AI ghost labor contingency in China, in mainland China as well. And this doesn't get as much attention because it's not being focused on by Western scholars or Western researchers. So, one of the big problems is that many government agencies here are mostly focused on catching up. They're not as focused on thinking about AI for good. So, the recent EU AI as an example, is a development of AI policy based off of the ability to reflect critically on the consequences and costs of AI for that region. But here in Asia, a lot of the governmental impetus doesn't think that that's feasible yet. Now, of course, it must be done because if we don't do it yet, it will be too late. But this is the sort of problem that a lot of Asian countries have is this feeling of inadequacy and need to catch up to what's going on with the West. So at some point, this has to be addressed. And I think, personally, I think there's a possibility. I think that China, Korea, and Japan and other countries here in this region have the capacity not only in terms of the human labor uh, ability, but also in terms of GDP and labor force generally, to decide that they don't want to cooperate with this exploitative development. Now, that's a question of motivating the right people in government. But I think there's a strong potential there. And I think that if countries like China and Korea do want to catch up to or be leaders for the world, they have to take on that responsibility.
What AI and big techs reveal about monopolized global markets? What are the possible ways to limit the actions of such corporations and setting borders on that?
Uh, that's hard. That's hard to answer. Um, because right now, so much of the uh, the market or the economy is disconnected from real value generation. But um, the stock market, for example, Elon Musk became the richest man right after, just shortly after Tesla finally had their first profitable year. This should be alarming to us. The stock valuation of Tesla has always been higher than is warranted by their the profit margins. Now, at some point, we expect these things will come up, will meet. But until then, people who wield this economic power do so without much repercussion. And of course, the challenge is that in a capitalist world, having money is tantamount to having power. So the richer you are, the more you can do. And again, case of Elon Musk is illustrative. He can buy his way into having a cherished seat within the cabinet of the American president. A number of years ago, Jeff Bezos got a seat on the board of the Pentagon. A lot of these tech companies have contracts with the US military and with other government agencies. And so there's a close, obvious connection between having money, producing technology, and having real political power. Um, of course, the thing about power, as we know, is that power is only possible if we accept that the power is there, that it's in many ways less real than people often think. Of course, it does have real repercussions. People starving on the streets know this, right? But as long as we give into it, as long as we accept that this is the real order, that the model of the world that people like the tech industry leaders think is the model that we should follow. As long as we accept that, they have power. So I think I will say this is the reason why I want to articulate something like what I'm saying tonight, what I wrote in my book. So I think we can change our minds about this. I think we can shift our focus. We can think of a different way of encountering the poor and thinking of technologies. And if we are capable of doing that, that can shift the way power relations here are aligned.
How the current international setting can help us to implement guidelines on the poverty civilization. Do Western nation will work on that?
So I think I think I think there's a strongly depends on how leaders of the world how they think of their position. Um, the EU, for example, tends to be very strongly oriented towards notions of human rights and protecting human rights. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, are oriented toward, in the eyes of the UN, and I think are fairly admirable, goals of promoting human rights. Um, in Asia, we tend to promote those a great deal as well. We have a strong interest in securing, and this I think is in a cynical way, I think this is somewhat self-interest, but we want to have strong positions within the United Nations. And as such, we at least give some attention to these sustainable development goals. I think whether or not we have the right interest at stake, the idea of trying to do this does open up some possibility. Now, the problem is the US has removed themselves from a lot of their interest in the United Nations, even though they still maintain a seat on the Security Council. A lot of Americans think very poorly of the UN. They think very poorly of international collaboration. And with the rise of nationalism and populism in many countries, this leads to the problem that the kind of conversations we need to have about promoting human rights, promoting authentic encounters with poor outside of our country and within our country will be overlooked as individual interests and national interests get promoted above everything else.
Thank you. Now, one last question. Isaac Correa asks, you have a critical view of AI. You see it as one more tool for profit in capitalism. Is it possible to see any benefit in the short run? For instance, could AI contribute to increase productivity and enable workers to have more free time?
I think it can. I think that is certainly a possibility, but I do think that those who are developing it and those who have vested interest in promoting it don't have that as a goal. We can see this when we look at other technologies that were supposed to save us time. For example, email, which is now not a new technology, but has been around for 30 or so years. And academics feel we have to be on call 24 hours a day. I come home from the school and my students email me and I feel a need to respond to them within a few hours, even if I'm with my family. So the challenge is that even though there is a possibility that we can change our relationships, that has to come from outside of the technology itself. And those who are developing it they don't have this interest as they're developing it. So I do think there's a possibility. I do think there's a great potential, just as I think many technologies that we're developing, if they're oriented towards the right goals, if they're configured within a system that honors and respects human beings and promotes really our well-being and our flourishing, they can be deployed in a way that's beneficial. AI, as I mentioned towards the end, it is incredibly efficient at mathematical processing. And there are a lot of ways that it's beneficial. Um, I mentioned this very briefly in passing, but I'll highlight one that I think is really significant. You may or may not know that the Nobel Prize for Chemistry this year went to AI researchers. And it went to them because their AI that they developed was incredibly adept at predicting protein folds, which is useful for new drug discovery. Now, human beings doing this work is very tedious. You have to examine all sorts of configurations of proteins, and it can be just time consuming for scientists and researchers who might be better using their time in the laboratory for something else. So, this is a very good advantage because we can discover life-saving drugs, life-saving medications. We can understand how to treat diseases better because of this. And I think this is an amazing and important development. I think there are similar things we see with, for example, radiation, radiology, with detecting cancer cells and other abnormalities within the body. There's a lot that the AI can do and that we should use it for. But I think the problem comes up that when we talk about it in these uncritical ways as being useful for everything, and when we think about it displacing people, and we don't have an adequate model for what we're going to do for those people, and we see it doing things that we want to be free to do, such as making art or writing, then I think there's good reason to be very critical of it. Why should I want AI to do my thinking for me? What I want AI to do for me is the work that is tedious, that is not dignified for me, that is not worthy of me being a human being. What I don't want it to do for me is the kind of stuff that really I feel dignified in doing, that I can feel my humanity being expressed through. So I I know that I sound just like a prophet of doom, but I really want to say that the only reason why is because I think the way that AI has been framed in a lot of conversations in the past few years has been significantly tied to this capitalistic goal of maximizing profit for a few people. And it hasn't really been thought about what the repercussions will be for most people. So if we think about how it really can be used to benefit humanity, and I don't mean in a general sense, but in specific ways, I think there's a great deal of potential there. I think, in fact, it can be a world changing technology for the good. But that's the big question we have to really push for.
Thank you. Juan Fernando Vaz asks, do you see difference in the production and implementation of AI technology in the And related to the US concept between the US and the Eastern world, what were the greatest differences?
Um, I don't think there's really that much difference, to be honest. The US has been ostensibly promoting it through free market. You see with companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon, actually, I guess we should call it Alphabet and Meta, Amazon, Tesla. But a lot of these companies have large contracts with the government for much of their work. And a lot of the pioneering AI work that has been done and still is being done in universities, many of which are public or state-funded universities. On the other hand, in Korea, Japan, China, there's been more explicit monies granted from the government for development of AI, but they're channeled through corporations as well. So here in China, Alibaba and Tencent have been among the greatest beneficiaries of China's AI plan. They've been commissioned, given huge grants to do AI research, and of course they are for-profit companies. They do a lot of business here in East Asia, not only in China but also across borders, Japan and Korea, Southeast Asia, and so forth. So there's still a strong for-profit goal. One of the interesting differences, I will note, has been that because China still has a semi-controlled economy and still has a lot of authority over what corporations can and cannot do, what a lot of people don't know is that China has stronger privacy protections for your digital information than the US does. Now, EU does a better job than the US does by far. Most countries do. But China has among the strongest privacy protections. However, those privacy protections only count for the corporations. So the government has access to all of your data, but the corporations can't do whatever they please with it. So there has been a different perspective on AI that way. But overall, a lot of it's the same. A lot of the interests are the same. And a lot of the collaborative work that's been done in AI across countries has been between the US and China in the first place, and between the UK and China in the second place. So there's still a lot of national interests which coincide.
Thank you, Professor. We are heading to the end of this meeting. If you want to say your final words.
Um, yeah, I think I've said a lot. There's a lot of issues at stake. I was talking with one of my students earlier this afternoon, and he was asking me, what is the work I'm doing on AI right now? And I feel many times I have a hard time expressing. You heard me talk for about 40 minutes, and I don't know if there was one single thought that came out of it. But I think the big concern for me is when we think about how we interact with other people, how we consider the human being. This to me is a very important question because we see that so many human beings around us are overlooked, are stepped over, are treated badly. Here in Hong Kong, I love the city of Hong Kong. It's a beautiful city. It's a very vibrant city. It's full of people. It's a very densely populated place. But we have homeless people who are ignored. We have people who don't have enough funding. We have people who live in very cramped conditions. We have people who are trafficked in and out of the city. These are real world concerns, and they ought to really grab our hearts and call us to action. And so when I hear people think about whether AI should be given proper respect and proper treatment, and still we have these problems in our cities and our communities and in many countries with lower incomes, I I find myself disturbed at how easily people want to overlook the reality that's facing us and look to something that is a nice fantasy but isn't real. An AI is not in any way at present in a place to appreciate human rights, whereas 12-year-old girls who are trafficked into the city are. And so I think this really ought to be for us the moral response we have is to think about how we include or don't include human beings into our moral reflection when we're thinking about a new technology.